Footage in this video was taken by Paul De Beer, J.J. Calloway, John Price, Jeff Todd, Edwin Wilmshurst and Trevor Rowe, to whom the tape is dedicated. During the 50s, ever more British enthusiasts were venturing to Spain to record activity on the state-owned, broad-gauged Renfe. Some explored the many narrow-gauge railways, many of which were suffering from severe road competition and crumbling infrastructure. Some already having passed to the Estado, which, like the Renfe, was another state-controlled body. For example, the two surviving lines radiating out from Gerona came under the Estado control in 1963. These two lines provide a perfect introduction to the lost delights of the world of the narrow gauge. The Olot-Gerona or OG line had introduced rail cars in 1960, steam subsequently being confined to the daily Correo or mail train as well as all the mixed trains. This was the OG station at Gerona. Although relatively flat, this British-built line passed through quite pleasant scenery on its 55-kilometre trip into the hills. Latterly, power was provided by 4 powerful 262 tank engines. The main facilities were at Amer, where these scenes were taken by Trevor Rowe in March 1965. The Correo departs towards Olot. Although most passenger trains were still well used, the declining goods traffic and the investment needed to keep the line running put the OG high on the closure list. The rolling stock included some ancient Cravens-built wooden four-wheel carriages. These had antique running boards providing access to the interior, along which also the guard would hang in order to collect the fares. The 4 Spanish-built tanks dated from 1926. These scenes by Paul De Beer. IOG would eventually close to all traffic in July 1969. At the front of this train, the special choreo van with its postbox, and at the rear, a birdcage roof brake van, complete with primitive toilet and a cage for dogs. The much-loved Helena to San Falou line also closed in 1969. In practice, this 750mm railway had remained virtually unaltered for over 75 years. The SFG had also some wonderful four-wheel rolling stock. However, by the 50s, road competition had virtually killed off all the traffic. At the rear of this train, an unusual-looking bogie carriage. In 1963, the line acquired 3 locos and some centre entrance bogie carriages from the recently closed Onda-Castellón line. Journey times on Spanish narrow-gauge railways were often dictated by the frequency of passing loops, so speeds tended to be quite leisurely. For example, the SFG took just under 2 hours to travel 39 kilometres. In latter years, all traffic was handled by Krauss-built 062 tank engines, delivered variously between 1890 and 1905. This was the newest edition, dating from 1905. Some sections of the SFG were quite steep, the little tank engines working hard to tackle the grades and the abundance of sharp curves. In its heyday, the railway had transported thousands to the beaches at San Falou, as well as freight from the town's small port. Main facilities were situated at the San Falou end. This charming time warp would finally chuff into history in April 1969. One of the shortest lived of the Levant coastlines was that linking Tortosa and La Cava, which opened in the late 20s with petrol rail cars. When these proved inadequate, 3 second-hand Hunslet-built 440s were acquired, one of which was filmed at La Cava by J.J. Calloway. Latterly, most traffic on the short 27-kilometre line was handled by French-built rail cars. Approaching Tortosa. Another 750mm gem was the remarkable Onda-Castellón Railway. Nicknamed La Penderola, after a kind of cockroach, this was in part a classic roadside tramway. It also featured a twisting section of street running through Castellón de la Plana. The heaviest traffic was always carried on the original 5-kilometre roadside tramway, with trains running approximately every 30 minutes right to the end between the port and the town. Some of the distinctive centre entrance carriages were later transferred to San Falou. After passing to the Estado in 1931, the workshops at the port end of the line also carried out work on narrow gauge equipment from other lines. The loco stock included a stud of Krauss and Hohenzollern 060 and 062 tanks. These diminutive locos were always immaculately turned out. Tracks of the one-time branch to the port. As in so much of Spain, competing buses had by the late 50s all but eroded the bulk of the traffic. Although one day in 1958, the little trains did take 28,000 people to the coast. It is a tragedy this idyllic line did not survive long enough to become a major tourist attraction. O62 number 5 rolls into the port station. Here both loco types were filmed on a mixto. The 062 tanks were probably the smallest compounds ever built. Beyond Castillon there was a far less frequent service to Onda and Burriana. Built to transport ironstone from Ojos Negros to the iron and steel works at Sagunto, this 200-kilometre line was demanding and difficult, the steeply graded outer section requiring the use of powerful mallees and garrots. Diesels would begin taking over in 1964. When Wilf Waters visited the railway in 1970, steam had all but disappeared, rusting carcasses dotting the blighted landscape. In evidence were both electric and diesel locos. Four North British-built Malleys had been delivered between 1909 and 1911. By now this once spectacular railway was in terminal decline. The end would come 2 years later when the Renfe took over the transportation of the iron ore. The meter gauge was lifted and the company was wound up in 1987. Only this North British 062 tank, dating from 1910, was in steam. Like many industrial locos, it carried a name. In this case, Canet. The massive Sagunto iron and steel complex had an internal meter gauge system as well as a standard gauge connection to the Renfe. The steam fleet included many 19th century veterans, although this 040 Hunslet-built saddle tank dated from 1907. Following closure in 1984, the site would be razed to the ground. By the early 60s, service on this, the oldest passenger-carrying meter-gauge line in Spain, which linked Cartagena to Denia, was mostly worked by a variety of Estado railcars. This was one of a group of Belgian-built 060 tanks, number 24, dating from 1912. The declining goods traffic, mostly cement, was latterly hauled by diesel locos. The line would close in stages between 1969 and 1974. First, views at Alcoy Shed, with an AG loco and a mid-20s Vienna Alcoy Yekler diesel railcar, the latter company possessing running rights over the final 10 kilometres of the AG. In its declining years, the AG stud of classic late Victorian Bayer Peacock 262 tanks proved to be a major attraction. Trevor Rowe filmed this activity in Alcoy Yard. Journey time for the 53-kilometre trip to Gandia was approximately 2.5 hours. Scenes now at the Gandia end of the line, filmed by Jeff Todd on the 3rd of April 1967. This flagman controlled movements over the diamond crossing with the Denia line. To reach Gandia station, AG trains undertook a complicated reversal. On leaving Gandia, the Bayer Peacock veterans rattle through the orange groves, covering the fertile coastal plain. Equally attractive were these Birmingham-built late Victorian wooden carriages. These signals were a sign that the AG had been British engineered and owned, control only passing to the Estado as late as 1965. Starting the steep climb up to the junction with the VAY line at Muro de Alcoy. Each of the locos was proudly named after a place along the line. Sadly, no one appears to have filmed this straggling cross-country railway, but Jeff Todd was very fortunate to find one of its locos working on the AG. This was number 5, one of the VAY stud of German-built 060 tanks dating from 1883. Jeff filmed the loco on the afternoon choreo from Gandia on the 3rd of April 1967, the mails being carried in the grey wagon at the front. This was one of the most desolate and remote sections of narrow-gauge track in the whole country. The AG trains chugging cautiously along a narrow, twisting ledge overlooking a steep gorge. With no continuous braking, the guard had to apply a handbrake situated on the balcony of the rear carriage. Built originally to transport agricultural produce, revenue had latterly been derived from bringing coal up to the textile and paper mills at Alcoy. Lugging his tape recorder, Jeff Todd walked over 4 kilometres on the 4th of April 1967 to secure this remarkable footage of the morning uphill working, again with VAY number 5 in charge. Some 20 kilometres from Gandia, the thirsty 060 tank engine had needed to take water. Lawrence Marshall recalls one occasion when, during a torrential downpour, passengers had to get out and push. The final 10 kilometres into Alcoy was shared with the VAY. Both lines were closed shortly after these sequences were filmed. Some brief scenes of narrow-gauge operations in Andalusia. 2 lines served Malaga, Estado railcars latterly working to Fuengirola. On the Malaga Suburban, a Belgian-built 060 tank pitches along the decaying track at the head of a mixed, including 3 of the line's American-style Wild West carriages. Diesels had largely taken over this mining operation when these panoramic views were taken at the shed on the outskirts of Sevilla. By this time the steam stock consisted of German-built 062 tanks. In the far west of Andalusia was a cluster of well-engineered British-owned railways, bringing iron pyrites to the port of Huelva. Before this, a short detour into the hinterland, where Trevor Rowe filmed the Encar operation at Peñarroya, where some classic 1901 American Baldwins shunted coal trains, as well as providing an internal service for the miners. Trevor also took these all too brief scenes of the tender tank engines used on the 750mm Valdepeñas-Puerto Llano railway. The Port of Huelva rail system provided connection with the Renfe. Trevor crossed the River Odiel to film its brightly coloured 040 tank. This British-owned mineral railway was laid to the unusual 4-foot gauge. Fast approaching its centenary, ODL, a Dubs-built 040, dated from 1867. Another little 040 was dwarfed by one of the line's bulky North British 080 tank engines, the last examples arriving as late as 1955. Another Scottish veteran of 1869 heads a rake of bouncing hoppers. The heavily used Rio Tinto Railway had a rich variety of locos to operate its mineral and passenger trains. For example, number 49 was an elderly Dubs 060 tank dating from 1881. Here it pulls out one of the short-lived batch of 6 Robert Stevenson and Hawthorne 260s, delivered in 1953-4. Known as the breadbasket of Spain, the hot, dusty central tableland had relatively few narrow-gauge lines. However, of considerable interest was this sugar factory some 20 kilometres southeast of Madrid, with its various gauge lines connecting at different points to the Renfe. In fact, one 600mm connection opened in 1922 was later converted to the European standard gauge. J.J. Callaway took these rare views in 1955, a few years before these operations came to an end. This grimy 1902 600mm loco had at some point been rebuilt into a tender engine. Star turn on the standard gauge was this Bayer Peacock 440 tank engine. Built in Manchester in 1863, this is the oldest loco seen on this tape. A glimpse next of the time-honoured, if somewhat dangerous skill of fly shunting. By the time the Estado took over this 225-kilometre network of relatively bleak lines, traffic had all but evaporated. The steam stock consisted of 13 Spanish-built 260 side tanks dating from 1911 to 1913. Railcars had failed to halt the slump, so the bulk of the system closed in July 1969. March 1965 on the street track in Valladolid. This prosperous line carried coal and passengers. Little visited until the early 70s, it later became a must for steam enthusiasts. Jeff Todd made this detailed study of the line in 1970. The PV provided 3 daily passenger trains in each direction, one of which, the Corio, was normally worked by one of the fleet of second-hand Krauss-built Engarth Type 260s, the Engarths being a combined engine and tender design. Of equal interest were the PV's 10 Baldwins dating from 1919. Here one of these typical American 262 tank engines brings a coal train down to the interchange sidings at Ponferrada. Whilst most coal was transferred onto the Renfe, some was used to fire local power stations and factories. Trains on this efficient, heavily engineered line achieve speeds hardly imaginable on many of Spain's other crumbling narrow-gauge railways. Baldwin number 7, named Araña Leopardo, arrives at Ponferrada, some 64 kilometres from the mines at Villablino. Number 17 was one of the favourites for passenger workings. Here the Engerth-type mogul heads north. Action at the interchange sidings with the Renfe main line. Here the PV kept a small stud of broad gauge locos for transfer work. 51 was a Belgian-built tank dating from 1922. These shunters were employed reassembling the coal wagons for their onward journey. '54 was another Belgian-built 060 tank, this time dating from 1927. The coal was emptied from the narrow gauge hoppers by means of a chute directly into the broad gauge wagons underneath. Baldwin number 5 prepares to start back up to the mines with a string of empties. Engerth number 12 of 1920 heads the 1530 Corio up the valley. Following behind, one of the line's 4 Spanish-built Engerth-type locos, which dated from the 1950s. Yet another train of empties, this time in charge of one of the German-built Engerths. Steam would survive on this rugged railway until the late 1980s. This small outfit on the border of Asturias and Galicia was owned by a local mining company. It was built to carry coal to the small port at Ribadeo. Only a few outside cylinder 260 tank engines were needed. Number 2 was built by Borsig in 1902. Heading a mixed train of empty hoppers and creaking four-wheel carriages, it sets off up the valley for the 32-kilometre trip to the mines. Rapid growth in road transport led to closure of this slow-moving little line in the early 1960s, not long after John Price took these rare views. This company had built a line to transport stone from its quarries down to a precast concrete factory at Mosul. The small stud of steam locos were all withdrawn by 1967. Before exploring the principal concentration of lines serving the north coast of the country, a look first at the heavily used La Robla railway, which linked Leon with the port of Bilbao. At 333 kilometres, this was the longest narrow-gauge railway in Spain. To upgrade its passenger services, 5 French-built Pacifics were acquired from the Tunisian railways in the late 50s. The La Robla followed a scenic route, winding in and out of the southern slopes of the Cantabrian Mountains. This Engath Mogul was another recent addition. By the late 50s, the busy La Robla had over 100 locos, ranging from small tanks to hefty garrets. The principal source of revenue came from the bulk transportation of coal. J.J. Callaway took these sequences whilst travelling to Leon behind one of the ex-Tunisian Pacifics of 1928. 56 was a Baldwin 280 of 1917. Passing 93, one of 3 powerful Skoda-built 282 tanks of 1926. This part of Spain possessed a wealth of narrow-gauge lines, many of which had been electrified. This line was the only one in Spain built entirely to the European standard gauge. Until 1958, the well-cared-for Langreo fleet consisted entirely of 060 tank engines. 49 was from a batch of 12 locos built in Spain by Babcock and Wilcox between 1925 and 1942. 54 was one of 5 German-built engines acquired from the Dutch railways in 1954. This was one of 9 Belgian-built tanks delivered variously between 1906 and 1914. The most famous feature on the 65-kilometre Langreo was this rope-hauled inclined plane, which carried some 30 coal and 4 passenger trains daily in each direction. 30 brings up the special brake van, which held the rope by means of a bolt passing through an eye in the rope's end. The brake van was also equipped with 2 types of emergency braking. J.J. Callaway took these evocative sequences in May 1957, shortly before the labour-intensive, time-consuming incline was replaced by a wide horseshoe curve. With a regular gradient of 1 in 8, the double tracks were in almost constant use, transporting 2 million passengers and 3 million tons of coal per year, this being equal to 1,000 hoppers a day in each direction. The gripper centre rails were for braking. As the rope was continuous, trains were able to pass up and down simultaneously. The limit for loaded hoppers making the descent was 8, for empties going up 13. Cresting the summit at San Pedro. The bustling yards at either end of the incline were controlled by coloured light signals and illuminated track indicators. A peep into the powerhouse with its Belgian-built stationary winding engine. This absorbing line would lose so much of its unique character with closure of the rope incline in 1963. Another fascinating location was the dam and crossing at Noreña. Here the multiple standard gauge Langreo tracks cross the meter gauge Asturian Railway linking Oviedo to Llanes. This 116-kilometre system was renowned for its beautifully kept locomotives. This was one of 9 282 tanks built in Spain by Babcock and Wilcox between 1942 and 1951. Most passenger trains were the preserve of some 20 German-built 262 tanks, dating from 1902 to 1921. Like the Asturian Railway, this 104-kilometre network linking Llanes to Santander also took great pride in its loco fleet. As with other railways, most engines carried brass name and builder's plates. Number 22 Escudo was a delightful 260 dating from 1904. This railway carried substantial traffic on both its local and longer distance trains. Nearly all its engines were nameless. Great favourites were the fleet of late Victorian 440 tanks built by the Glasgow firm Dubs. These handsome Scottish-built tanks tended to be employed on the heavily used local trains. Larger, more powerful tender engines were needed for through workings between Bilbao and Santander. These longer distance trains, including the daily Correo, usually had more modern carriages, although a 4-hour journey on wooden seats must have been quite taxing. Action on the busy approaches to Costa station in Santander. Here the SB and the Cantabrian ran on separate but parallel tracks. Both companies also had shed facilities and extensive marshalling yards. A Cantabrian mogul nears the end of its journey. Between turns, the crews always found time for a little spit and polish. Cantabrian 24 of 1906 had been rebuilt in the late 40s. A Victorian loco and Victorian wooden coaches. What more could one want? Inevitably, diesel rail cars were making ever more inroads when Jeff Todd filmed these sequences in 1967. Cantabrian 262 tank on another well-filled local. Although steam bowed out on both the Cantabrian and the SB about a year later, both railways, now state-run, remain in operation. By 1967, this small industrial concern near Castro Urdiales would have replaced most of its motley collection of 040s with diesels. John Price visited the line in order to film the kilometre-long rail and road tunnel down to the harbour. This major industrial railway had a positive aversion to visitors, especially those armed with cameras. These rare views of ex-Tunisian 2660 Malays were taken by Trevor Rowe. Also bustling about were some elderly German-built 260 tanks. This nostalgic trip into the lost world of Spanish narrow gauge concludes with another visit to San Falou. Wilf Waters made the following film in 1968 during the dying months of the SFG, when it had the dubious distinction of being the country's last 750mm passenger carrying railway. Using a 16mm camera, he spent several days recording all aspects of the leisurely magic of a disappearing age. Sit back, relax, possibly sip a sangria, and soak up the sights and sounds of this most charming of Spain's narrow gauge railways.
Valeu.